Okay, good morning you guys. Thanks for coming, thanks for finding parking. I'm sure we'll see a few people trickle in over the next few minutes as well. Welcome to my, I think, entire counseling team. It was our counseling team meeting this morning, so they all had a field trip. Yeah. We are PCRS, Pacific Community Resources Society. We're a long-standing not-for-profit agency, and we work and run programs right from Vancouver all the way out to, I guess, Caramitos at this point. And we work with youth and adults and families in vulnerable communities and try to make better lives. I am Jody. I am Caregivers Support Counselor, along with Shanda. Hi, Shanda. I'm going to be taking off at 11 o'clock for Costa Rica.
Oh, yeah.
I know.
You worked hard for it.
So Shanda will be taking care of things in the second half of the program over. But I want to welcome Rebecca Mitchell. It's Rebecca's first time with us. Rebecca also works with Dr. Lapointe at the Wishing Star Clinic. And she's a clinical counselor there. And you've had lots of experience with the ministry, as I understand.
I worked for the ministry for 16 years.
Yeah, so she worked with NCFD for quite some time as well. So,
yeah,
welcome, and I look forward to hearing more. We all know about emotional regulation, sort of as the buzzword in most of the work we're doing these days. So, pretty excited to hear more about that from Rebecca. So,
Thank you. Hello, everybody. We're kind of switching on the fly. We had a little bit of a mix-up. So I was coming this morning thinking I was talking about siblings, and I'm not. I'm talking about emotional regulation. So in planning for this, I had wanted to add some more things in, but I'll just talk about those things that I had possibly wanted to add in. And hoping that this morning can be a bit of a conversation as well, as we're all dealing with unique situations and unique children. But overall, we'll talk about sort of how it is that children develop emotional regulation and what's our role in that process. How does it unfold? What do we need to understand in terms of development, in terms of early experiences that children have had, and that sort of thing. So we'll walk through that concept. Now, those of you who have been to a lot of Dr. Lapointe's presentations, you've probably seen this slide. Have you guys gone through this slide before? Yeah. So one of the ways that we like to start is just talking about the significant role that we're all playing in terms of growing the brains of children. Because in growing those brains, what we're really talking about is helping neurons talk to other neurons in a specific way, right? And being in the role of foster care, you have very different and unique brains coming into your homes, right? Many of which have not had the start that they were meant to have. And so when we're talking about emotional regulation and we're talking about building those pathways in the brain of sort of that high arousal to calm, often we talk about, for many children, that unfolds with that sort of attuned caregiving, that sense that kids know that we know what they need, and so when upset happens, we're able to step in and help sort and settle all of that, and so those upset neurons get to talk to those calm down neurons, and when that happens over and over and over again, those pathways get strengthened in the brain. The challenge, I think, often is when you're in the role of caring for children through adoption or fostering, and they come with a variety of experiences, often lack of the experiences needed, is you're coming with brains that haven't always been built from the bottom up, right? And so when we talk about creating those pathways, we may be looking at different types of things. Because to build a brain from the bottom up, certain input needs to go into that brain. So if you have a 10-year-old child in your care, and that brain hasn't been properly built in terms of the foundation, you may be doing different things than just simply saying, I can see you're feeling really sad and I've got you and we'll get this all sorted out, right? We may need to look at what were some of those things that were missed in the beginning and how can we put that input in. A lot of times we're talking about the somatosensory input that infants get when they get the rocking and the touch and all of those things that a lot of children haven't received. So sometimes what I talk about, especially in the area of emotional regulation, for children that have experienced that early abuse, neglect, maltreatment, or toxic stress, is that we often have to go backwards in order to go forwards. And that can be a big challenge when you have a 10-year-old with the brain development of an 18-month-old, right? So this is where you're all sitting in unique situations. So we're going to talk a lot just in terms of general terms about what we need to consider in terms of emotional regulation and responding to children, and then we'll try and add in some of the unique pieces that might suit your needs a little bit more. When I talk about this, I do like to talk about the role of temperament, because in terms of talking about emotional regulation, we have to consider that we all came into this world wired a little bit differently. And so we're considering not only temperament, but we're also now considering early experience and how that's impacted the wiring of children. So just on a note of general temperament, we look at the fact that some of us, not many, I don't know how many, but maybe once we land on a beach in Costa Rica, we sort of fall in this category, come into the world pretty chill. Like our systems are pretty regulated, there's not too much that sort of gets us ruffled. We can sort of haul those little ones along and change routine, and they transition pretty well, and they don't get too flustered. Others of us come into the world in terms of what we call much more intensely aware, and that's just sort of more of everything, right? In terms of our how we feel emotions, how we express emotions, it's more. What we perceive, it's more. How much we sort of struggle to adapt from one thing to another is more. And so when we're talking about emotional regulation, we need to look at and consider temperament, number one, because that's something that is fairly stable within us. If we think about raising our own children and we look at that, often, we say the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, right? And so there's a lot that comes in here. Now let's add in adverse early experiences for children, and it's sort of difficult to look at temperament, but what we can look at, and what we'll look at a little bit later, is that how those baseline arousal states get set when all of those things don't happen that were meant to happen to build those bottom brains going up to the top. So the reason I like to talk about this is because a lot of times parents will come in, and when we start talking about the challenges, some of what we can identify is that this is temperament. This is a highly sensitive child who has an intense emotional expression. And sensitivity is not something that we typically can change, but it's something that we can recognize and that we can work with. And so if we're cognizant of that, that helps us to be able to wire those pathways, because we have more attunement and we have more sensitivity in terms of what's happening for that child. I have two boys, 14 and 19. My oldest probably falls along this, kind of like in here, right? And so he was the kid I could take into a grocery store, and he'd be sitting in the cart, and people were saying, "Oh, he's so well behaved. You must be such a wonderful parent." And I was like, "Sure, yeah." My second one came along, and I remember going to the grocery store one day. He was about 3, and I came home and I said to my husband, "I'm never taking this child to the grocery store again." Because it was a nightmare. He's so intense, and he was just so overstimulated by everything. I think he was literally like running around the potato chip display, and I've of course run into like 5 people in the community, right? So you're like, not only am I a great parent, but I'm a great parent educator, but that's just who he's been. And so as we've raised him, we've really learned to be aware of that sensitivity and how easily he gets overwhelmed, and that a lot of times we have to, we can only sort of load so much onto him, Starting high school was a big thing. He struggled with speaking in the early years. And so one of the things I said to my husband is I said, my only goal for him that first year of high school is to go to school. If we're not doing sports, if we're not doing activities, that's cool, because we just need to keep the stress down, because that may be all he can handle. And I'm not homeschooling. I thought I would be by about October first year. So, we've been able to work with that. But I think this is really important to consider. And then we'll talk a little bit more about arousal states as well. So, some of the things that I just like to highlight in terms of considerations of emotional regulation, number one is thinking about what does brain development have to do with emotional regulation. And I think there's a lot of information that we have not, did not get as counselors going through all of our training, as care providers or foster parents going through your training. A lot of this information came to light for me when I did my studying with Gordon Neufeld and did his level 1 and level 2 intensives. And that sort of really opened my eyes to truly making sense of children and thinking and maybe we just didn't know all of this at this point. We're getting so much knowledge around neuroscience. So I want to talk about that in terms of our awareness around that. I also want to talk about arousal states and what does that have to do with emotional regulation. And when we recognize where kids are at or where we're at in our arousal states, how can we change those responses to build those pathways in the ways that we're wanting to build the pathways. And then what does connection have to do with emotional regulation? Okay, so the developing brain. Here's what was earth-shattering to me probably about 4 or 5 years ago when I did this training, is thinking about coexisting hemispheres, left and right brain, versus connected hemispheres. Having the left brain talk to the right brain, okay? So what do we need to understand about this? First of all, we need to understand that a young brain is not just a smaller version of the adult brain, right? We're so fortunate now to have the field of neuroscience and the ability to know so much about the brain and how it develops and all the neuroplasticity, but I still get surprised on a daily basis by how many of us think that these little people are just thinking like little adults walking around. It's kind of shocking to me, and I probably fell into that at certain points as well. But it's really important that we understand that. And so when we think about emotional regulation, we have to understand what it takes to temper those big feelings. All of those emotions that get flooded in children, what does it take? We need to understand what a child may or may not yet be wired up to do, not based on age, but based on that child. So you may have a child who by age 6, 6.5, 7 has started to be wired up to temper some of those big feelings. You may be caring for a child who's 15 and that wiring has not yet happened. And we'll talk about why that is. And we need to realize that in order for that emotional regulation to develop, in order for those big feelings to be tempered, we have to be able to create a mixing bowl in our brain. So we'll talk about that. So we need to be developmentally informed, we need to be trauma informed in order to make sense of and respond in ways that develop and promote maturation, okay? So what's the story of the brain? Basically, it starts out one at a time, right? And if you think about development, a lot of development starts out one at a time, because if everything developed at once, it would just be a big muddled mess, right? So before the ages of 5, children come into the world with a fully developed right hemisphere and a fully developed left hemisphere. So the ability to do all of the logic and sequencing and connecting things on the left brain, and all of the emotions and sort of abstract thinking that come on the right brain. So we're born with both of those pieces in place, but what we're not born with is the ability for those two sides to communicate. So what that means is that young children experience things one at a time. One emotion at a time, one impulse at a time, one perspective at a time, right? And if you don't understand that, we start to see a lot of, we could identify a lot of mental health challenges early on in children, right? And so also what's important to understand is that much of our early years is spent in our right hemisphere. And so what happens is that can make children look really irrational. They look defiant, they look bipolar at times, right? One minute they're really happy, the next minute they're melting down, one minute they love you so much, the next minute they hate you. All of those things because I'm not able to feel happy and mad at the same time. I'm not able to share that toy with Johnny because I'm not able to hold on to the perspective that I want some time with the toy, but Johnny might also want some time with the toy. And if I don't share the toy, Johnny might feel kind of sad about that. I can't hold on to that. I can only hold on to the fact that I want the toy or Johnny wants the toy. And so even if I wanted to play with it and I was thinking of Johnny's perspective, I would just give it to him, right? Does that all kind of make sense? We also have this wonderful ability in those early years to believe in magic and that anything is possible, right? So again, because the logic side is not yet wired up to all those things we're feeling and wanting, young children or children who have not developed this ability yet, so it could be a young child, it could be a 10-year-old child, 15-year-old child, has not developed that ability. And so if I want orange juice and you tell me there's no orange juice in the house, I want orange juice. But sweetie, we don't have any orange juice. We have cranberry juice, we have apple juice. I want orange juice, right? Because anything can happen. It's magic, right? You should just be able to magically have orange juice appear, because that's all my brain can do. So if we don't understand this, do you see how we can get tripped up on a lot of things and not understanding things and our own frustration? But if we see that, oh, he's not able to feel happy and sad at the same time, or want this but realize that might get him in trouble, then a lot of what young kids do, or kids that have not yet matured, it makes perfect sense, right? It makes perfect sense. I, a while ago, had a mom state her worry that her son was seeming to be following the lead of this other boy, and she said, I'm just worried he's going to be a follower because he has this experience that he wants to play with Johnny, but when Fred says he can't play with Johnny, he goes and plays with Fred. And I said, well, that just kind of tells us where his brain's at right now, right? In that moment, all he can take on is Fred's perspective. He isn't able to yet take on the fact that I want to play with Johnny, but Fred doesn't want me to. How can I work that out? So you kind of get the sense that, we often put children in situations that they're not yet wired up to do. Let's think about preschool and daycare, and we need some really well-informed, intuitive caregivers to be able to step in and compensate for a lot of what's missing so that it can start to develop. The thing that's really important to realize here is that aging is inevitable. Right? We all experience that. No matter what we do or what we do. I've discovered coconut oil. I'm trying it on the eyes. I think it's helping a little bit. But I'm still getting older each year, right? And all the things that come with that. So aging is inevitable. It happens. What we sometimes take for granted or don't realize is that maturity is not inevitable, right? Maturity happens when conditions are conducive to allow that to unfold. So we all age, we don't all mature based on aging, right? So if you think about some of the people you know, you might think of a 25-year-old that has not yet matured, and the brains are still sort of completing all of that growth. You may know a 45-year-old that has not yet matured. I have a couple of 63-year-olds in my family that have not yet matured. They're not even close, right? And whether they'll get there, it's possible because we have the neuroplasticity, but whether the conditions can be put in place. So in knowing that, I think is really important because we can't make the mistake of assuming that because a child's 7, they shouldn't be acting that way. Or because a child's 12, they should be beyond that, right? We have to really work to try and recognize where is this child at. And often, if we're able, we don't always get as much helpful information as we would like as care providers. Sometimes we have children come into our care and we're kind of blind to what's happened to them in their early years. But if we can assume, or if we know there's been a great deal of adversity, and sometimes not even a great deal, but some adversity in those early years, we can at least be more cognitively aware that there may be a chance that that child didn't have that opportunity to mature. And so I need to really observe where that child is at and start at that point, right? And sometimes I feel there's this intention, positive intention or need to catch kids up, right? Well, they don't know how to do this yet, and they don't know how to do that yet, and so we're going to set this up, and we're going to ask them. And sometimes I listen to caregivers or parents, all with wonderful intentions, but the expectations are huge for brains that have not yet been built. They have not yet been built. And so if our job is to build those brains, because that is your job, right? You have an opportunity to help those brains become regulated so that they can, because they build from the bottom up and the back to the front. And so if that bottom has not been a good foundation, that top part is not going to develop in the way that it was meant to develop, right? So you have an opportunity through those day-to-day interactions, through all of helping those neurons talk to those neurons, but in order to do that, we have to really think about and appreciate where a child is at, not what age they are. And that's, I think, one of the most important things. So if we just, Vanessa likes lots of pretty pictures, and she likes to talk about Play-Doh. I won't talk about Play-Doh that much. But this is just to give you an example of what is needed in terms of self-control and emotional regulation. And so again, we start out with 2 different thoughts or 2 different feelings beginning one at a time. And if they can come together and exist at the same time, right? So I really want to eat all of that Halloween candy, but I know it's going to make me feel really sick, or I'm going to regret it afterwards. If we can have those 2 thoughts at the same time, we often can exhibit that self-control. Now, the other thing that we need to be aware about, and think about if you've had this experience, is that even if we do have brains that have matured and grown, as I like to think that most of us have, when feelings become too intense and too overwhelming, guess what happens? The Play-Doh all squishes together and we lose our mix, right? And so we'll talk about that as well in arousal states. And if you can think about a time that that's ever happened for you, it can be quite overwhelming. It can feel quite scary. The one story I tell, I'm almost embarrassed to tell it, but I'll tell it because full disclosure. sometimes I have these things that happen, and then I always sort of try and put myself in the shoes of a child and think about, oh my goodness, if that's what it feels like for me as an adult with a grown, developed, regulated brain most of the time, what would that feel like for the child? So this was years ago. So I've done some more mindfulness since then. But we had put some new flooring in our house, and we had some problems with the noses on the stairs. They were cracking. And I was like, we haven't had these floors for that long. These noses should not be cracking. So I phoned the flooring people, and she was like, oh, well, those aren't covered under any sort of warranty. And I said, okay, I hear what you're saying, but we've only had these floors for a few months, and there's no reason they should be cracking. So I don't even think this is an issue of warranty. Like, I think it was not put in properly. I'm sorry, they're not covered under warranty. And she kept going on and on and on. And it was one of those, like, it was the principle of it for me. And I was like, you're not getting what I'm saying. You're not hearing me. And as I'm trying to get my point across on the phone to this poor woman, I get escalated to the point, like, I'm now yelling at her, and I can feel my heart, like, you know, like my heart, like at the front of my chest, it was just like this, and my face goes red, and I'm shaking, and finally I just was like, fine, and I hang up the phone, right, and like my little intense guy, don't know where he gets it from, was standing in front of me, but I had this moment where I was like, whoa, that felt scary. That felt really out of control, and like, nobody was here to kind of step in and help me with that. And so I just had this moment. I thought, if that's how it felt for me as an adult, how does that feel for a young child? We have a next door neighbor right now, and they're really struggling with their youngest son, and we live kind of close, and so unfortunately we can hear most of what goes on. And he just gets to that point where he's like 13 now, and he's just yelling with all of his might. And I just feel like he's just losing his little mind, right? And my heart just goes out for him and for the family, because I just think that's a really scary feeling. Now, the thing that we also have to realize is that we can't necessarily place judgment on the things that other people find too intense. Right? And we tend to do that a lot. You know, it's not a big deal that you're not getting the cookie right now. There's going to be lots of cookies later, you know? And so what's intense or overwhelming for us may be very different than what's intense or overwhelming for the children that are in your care. And so if we're able to sort of step back and just try and put ourselves in their shoes for what they might be feeling in this moment, that helps guide us in those responses. Does that make sense? Yes. Any thoughts or questions about that? Yeah. Did you want to share a full disclosure story?
My grandson is 12.
Yeah.
And they had crazy hair day.
Oh, yes.
And so we put food coloring in his hair, but because it was dark red,
yes,
it didn't show up that well. And I
Yes.
said, well, let's try doing a color on St. Patrick's Day, which is this Friday.
Yeah.
And so we went to the hair salon where they sell product, and we bought the stuff to put in his hair. And I've never dyed before, so I don't know, and I asked questions. So we got it in, and it's like a really deep, deep forest green. So it did show up in his hair. Now he's really disappointed. And so he says, well, we need to bleach my hair. He's telling me what to do, and I'm saying, no, we can't, because he just had it cut short after.
Yes.
So I'm like, he's holding me to that bleaching and redoing the hair.
Yes, and that's really intense for him, right? Like, my world is gonna end if this hair doesn't turn out the way I want it to turn out. And so, yeah, thank you. I'm just gonna go over that one. So let's talk a little bit about arousal states. How many of you have had any training or any exposure to Dr. Bruce Perry? Okay. Any of you read The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog? Yeah. That, I think, again, was another game changer for me, especially working in infant mental health and supporting some of the kids that we were supporting in care and came in through adoption. So if you're really wanting to kind of make sense and understand the brains of children who have had that early developmental trauma, that's a really good reference to. It's a super easy It's not technical and all of that. It just is like, whoa, that makes sense, right? So the boy who was raised as a dog. So Dr. Perry talks a lot about arousal states and the arousal continuum. And again, for me, this was very eye-opening because it sort of really described what I could or couldn't accomplish in certain moments. And it also helped me to make sense of what's happening for other children potentially in those moments. So just in general, to look at this is to recognize what part of our brain are we accessing at the different arousal states. So when we're calm, most of you look pretty calm here this morning, right? At least after we got parking. I was not so calm down in the parking garage. I got here no problem, and then I'm like, I'm never going to get out of this parking garage, and I'm not sure if I'm ever going to find my car again, but I'm sure it'll all work out. I'll be very alert as I'm going down the elevator. But now that we're here and we found our parking, we're all calm, and we're sort of at this state of rest, right? And because we're at this state of rest and feeling calm, we're in that neo-subcortex. We're in that thinking part of our brain. So we can think abstractly, right? We can think about, oh yeah, when Rebecca said that, it made me think of this situation. Or now I understand what's happening here, or potentially so we're able to sort of do all of that good thinking. We're able to be flexible in our responses. We're able to empathize. We're able to do all of those wonderful things that our neo and subcortex are meant for us to do. As we become more alert, we move down. We start to move down, leaving that subcortex going down into that limbic system. And so as we're alert, our thinking and our reacting becomes more concrete, right? Think about a time when you had something in mind, or you thought it was supposed to go this way, and it didn't go that way, or you're needing to change, but you're uncertain about it, and so you get kind of like really stuck. I get that way sometimes around computers because I could say I'm talented, but I'm not talented with computers. Early in my marriage, I ended up wiping out our entire hard drive, and I don't think I've ever recovered fully from the trauma of that. And so if something's going on in my computer, I have 2 teenage boys, well, 1 young adult now, they're wonderful with computers. They're like, Mom, I'm like, but don't touch that. It's Mom's slides. These are my presentation. Mom, it's going to be okay. And I can get very sort of concrete in my thinking in terms of what's supposed to happen. If we think about with children, we think about as they start to lose that flexibility, if they've even had that flexibility, then we can start to think about, okay, they're going into that limbic part of your brain. When you're raising or caring for children who are highly sensitive, their baseline, I find, is often at that alert stage. Because they're thinking about so much, right? We had an experience a couple years ago. My youngest started umpiring for baseball. And there's a lot of, that's kind of a scary thing to do. It's kind of overwhelming. I was kind of shocked that he wanted to do it. But we needed to get black pants. And so I said, well, we live in White Rock. There's not a lot of great stores as of yet, but let's go to Walmart and try it, right? And he's kind of in the man-child, like in between the child and the man stage, right? Just really hard to find clothes. So we go into Walmart, and I said, well, let's see if we can see anything in the youth section, that's this big. And so we go over there, and in his mind, I think he has they have to be dress black pants, suit pants, right? So we go over there, there's not a lot to choose from, but they have sort of black khaki pants, that chino kind of khaki pants. And I was like, well, what do you think about these? Nope, that's not what they're supposed to be. That's not what they're supposed to be. And I know we're not getting anywhere at this moment. I'm not going to be able to convince him. So I said, okay, you know what? Let's walk. This is what happens when we move and walk. start to sometimes settle that central nervous system. So let's walk over to the men's section. Maybe by some chance they'll have some extra small, they wouldn't, pants in the men's section. So we walk over to the men's section, we look at these suit pants, put them up. No, that's not gonna work. What are we gonna do? I don't know. Why don't we walk all the way back to the youth section? We'll just look at it one more time, right? So we go all the way back to the youth section and we pull out the exact same pants, and he looks at them and he says, you know what, Mom, I think those will probably work just fine. Oh, because I hated being in Walmart. Anyway, so, but that whole experience is recognizing that, you know, we sort of came in kind of on the alert. We had to get to the calm before, and so it was this back and forth. And so if I would have stayed in that youth section and said, Liam, you're being unreasonable. You're being ridiculous. They just have to be black. Exactly. We would have gone up and up and up and up, and he probably would have stomped out of Walmart, right? Which is what a lot of kids do. Anyway, it wouldn't have been any different than most parents, but I had a parent say that to me the other day. She was talking about her son melting down in a coffee shop, and she goes, I wouldn't have minded if it was Walmart, because all kids melt down in Walmart. But it was the coffee shop. I was like, yeah, that's why I don't go into Walmart. Okay, so then as our arousal state goes up and we get into more of that alarm, now we're moving further down into our brain and we're going into that emotional brain. And so what we experience in terms of our responses is our responses become, we're in our emotional brain and our responses become emotional. Emotional, right? Emotional, because that's where we're at in our brains, right? As we move up this continuum, we no longer have access to that calm part of our brain, right? When we're here, we might have a little bit more flexibility at that alert stage to get them down, but when now we're hitting alarm, that gate is closing pretty quickly, right? So our reactions become emotional. Now, this is really important for us to realize, because if we're trying to build brains that are emotionally regulated, and we get stuck on consequencing emotional reactions, or saying, I don't like it when you speak to me that way, that's inappropriate, that's unacceptable, what's going to happen to their arousal system? It goes up and up and up, right? So now we have an alarmed neuron that's going to start talking to a totally freaked out reactive reflexive neuron. And those aren't the kinds of brains that we want to build, because they don't function very well in our society, right? So, I'll tell you another story. My Liam, he gives me so many stories to tell. I always say if I was going to write a book, I will give him the proceeds of the book, because I probably couldn't write it without all of my experience with him. But I tell this not to talk about myself or my child, but I tell this just to kind of help you see what it looks like, right? So one day, he had come home from doing paper route with our neighbor. Everything had gone wrong on the paper route that day that could go wrong, right? He came in the house, it was like he had had the worst day on the job ever. So I was like, oh, come on in, sit down, what happened? It was horrible, Mom. We had flyers today, and Ethan's dad wouldn't stay, and he could have stayed for just a little while, but he wouldn't stay, so we couldn't fit them all in the wagon, and all the flyers fell out. We had to re-put the flyers in, and then I left the bungee cord 2 blocks behind, and it's like everything except getting attacked by a dog happened on that paper route that day. And so he came in, and he was very unsettled. And so I said, well, let's sit down and have a snack. We don't have that much time, and we have to get to baseball training. This was a new round of baseball training we were doing that didn't have a lot of his friends in it this time. But this was his only sport at the time, right? If you have sensitive children, you go through a lot of sports and realize a lot of them don't work for them. And so I said, let's sit down, let's have a snack, and we need to get ready for baseball. I don't want to go to baseball. And I said, well, Liam, I said, you stop running track, you're not playing hockey, you keep telling Dad and I that you love baseball. I do love baseball! I'm not kidding. And he's so lovely and so lovely. And so I had a couple of choices in that moment, right? I could look at him and say, don't you dare speak to me that way. I didn't do anything to you. I didn't leave you in the paper route. Get to your room and you can come back when you can be respectful, right? How would that have turned out for me? Horrible, right? But I was able to recognize he's in the emotional part of his brain. This is where he's at. And what's my job? My job is to help that emotional neuron speak to that calm down neuron. So how do I step in and start to co-regulate those emotions so that he comes back down here and can experience some flexible responses, right? So it was a couple of things that fortunately worked out in that particular instant. It doesn't always. But those things that worked out was for me to, number one, acknowledge. I get that going to a new training program and not having your friends there is you're feeling a little uneasy about that. I get that, right? We're gonna have a snack. We're gonna go this time. And if you go this time and it's really not your cup of tea, then we won't continue. I said, you know, I've got your back. Mom knows what you need, right? So I'm kind of like being that compass point. I'm talking very calmly. I'm not saying anything about the, I do love baseball response. I didn't say anything about that, right? That was enough in that moment to bring us back down here for him to say, okay, I'll go this time. And fortunately, he actually then continued on with that program. But if I would have reacted to his reaction, if I would have tried to force him to go or consequence him if he didn't go, and believe me, I tried that when he was little. You need to get on that soccer field right now or we're not playing with Ben afterwards, right? But he was in such a state of fear or terror, I could have threatened him with his life and he wasn't getting on that soccer field. So that's what you have to really understand, is that unless we work with where they're at in their brain, we're not going to achieve what it is that we're wanting to achieve. And what we're wanting to achieve are healthy, regulated brains, right? That's what we're wanting to achieve. We don't want to grow up a bunch of stressed out brains. So, does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, okay. And so then it just goes from there. As the arousal goes up, you get fear, you get terror. Now our reactions are just reflexive and reactive, right? Now the challenge, as I said, if you have a child who's highly sensitive, quite intense in nature, my experience has been often their baseline is the alert stage. Because when you get those sensitive brains, anything new, anything different, anything that I don't know what it's going to feel like, or I'm not sure how it's going to be, or what's going to happen, or I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to be successful at it, and if I don't do this, are people going to be looking at me? Are they going to be laughing at me? Am I, you know? So in a lot of experiences, when you have those intense, sensitive children, their baseline is at alert. And so you have to be aware of that when you walk into Walmart trying to find a pair of black pants, right? For children that have been through early adverse experiences, toxic stress, neglect, abuse, maltreatment, often their baseline is at alarm or fear. And why is that? Because their brains became very good at being stressed out brains because that's what they practiced, right? So when we think about when children, does everyone really understand the term toxic stress? I think this is important because toxic stress, when we think about it, is continual stress without any buffering, right? So we all may have experienced certain stresses. We probably experience stresses day by day. And part of being here and connecting with each other is buffering that stress, right? But when children have been put in that toxic environment with no buffering, that's what we call toxic stress, and that's what builds brains with those sensitized stress response systems that can just become really good at being stressed out. Because neurons that fire together, wire together, right? So if that's what they've experienced. Now the good news is that we can change those brains. It's not easy, but we can do it. But we have to understand where they're at in order to do that. So if we have a child who is in that state of fear or terror, what is it that they're needing to feel? What is it that they're needing to believe? What is it that they need their brain to think in order to start to come back down that continuum?
That they're safe.
That they're safe, exactly. You guys are brilliant, right? Because no matter what's happening, you could be asking them to hang their coat up. And they go into that fear, that state of terror, right? But what we need to recognize is when they go there, that's what's happening. And what that brain and what that system needs to register is that they're safe. There are no bears, there are no lions and tigers in the room right now. And it can be counterintuitive if we don't understand that child's experience, right? And a lot of the children that come into our care or who we support, we don't understand that experience. We don't know what those triggers are. We don't know that that child was eating lasagna the night that the police and the social worker came in and removed them. And so guess what happens when foster mom makes this beautiful lasagna meal? That child goes into absolute fight or flight mode. And we have no idea why, right? And so sometimes we don't know why. But if we can recognize where they're at in their brain, we're able to step in and provide what they need. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about the brain that does the co-regulating.
Yeah.
It might be quite exhaustive.
The brain that does the co-regulating,
Right.
meaning
So
your
the
brain?
parent,
Absolutely.
So,
Yes,
and so
absolutely.
that can be a difficult thing to achieve.
Yes.
Is co-regulating a brain when you're already done.
Yes, yeah, it is, it is. We cannot regulate very effectively unless we're regulated. And so we might be a little bit better at regulating from wake up time until noon, but come about 4 o'clock in the afternoon or 8 o'clock in the evening, our brains have been very stressed, right? And that's reality, that's life. We're not gonna be able, what you have to think about is each time that child has that experience of that support with that co-regulation, you're impacting that brain. It doesn't mean that it has to be every single time, because that's not life and that's not reality, right? I just want to talk a little bit about this in terms, and I'm so thrilled that safety was the thought that came up, because again, I think we can get tripped up over the outward expression of what's happening in the brain, and we can get tripped up over thinking this is ridiculous that we're having this issue over this, right? I won't promise it's the last story that I'll tell, but it might be. Liam was about probably 7-ish, 7, 8 maybe, 7, 8. And one evening, he was having a little bit difficulty adjusting to the fact that TV time was now over, right? And so once the TV was turned off, and I don't remember how that all came about, his arousal started to go up. So he's in the middle of the living room. We have sort of this open concept house, and at the time, when both my parents were living, my parents were downstairs. And so he's in the living room, kind of sounding like what our neighbor sounds like right now, and he's just screaming his little head off, right? He's like, oh, not TV! Oh, I'm gonna turn it back on, or whatever was happening, right? And I'm like, we do this every single day. This was no change in our routine. He was just struggling in that particular moment. So I tried to be very big and in a supportive way, but I said, Liam, we're not standing in the middle of the living room and yelling for the world to hear. Come with me, we'll get this sorted out, right? So I'm sort of gently escorting him to his room. I stay in his room with him, and he still loses his mind. So I'm in the room, the door's closed, and he keeps running at the door because he wants out, right? He's now in flight mode. So I said, we're not going anywhere until we get to calm. Our only job is to get to calm. Running, we're not going anywhere until we get to calm. I'm right here, our only job is to get to calm. I'm not saying anything about his reaction. I'm not saying anything about the fact that he's never going to watch TV again until he's 30 years old. I'm not saying anything about that. I'm saying our only job is to get to calm. So after about 3 attempts to run through me and the door, it's like now I don't know what else to do. So he was in flight mode. Now he actually shifts into fight mode, right? So now we're in our little 10 by 10 bedroom, and he picks up his desk chair, and he's getting ready to throw it. And honestly, he's such a lovely child. I almost feel guilty telling these stories. But it's just reality of kids, right? So he picks up his chair, he's ready to throw it, and I just said, Liam, you're safe. I'm right here. You are safe. And he put down his chair and he just dissolved into a puddle of tears, which is where we needed to get to. Why? He needed to register the futility of that situation, and he needed to feel vulnerable and soften in that, right? And so by giving him that sense of safety, he didn't have to fight anymore. He could go back down into that emotional brain, melt into that puddle of tears, and then eventually we got to that calm. And that was for me a really pivotal moment as a parent. I think that was all actually happening as I was going through my Gordon Neufeld training. And it was one of those like, that's what Gordon's talking about. That's what that feels like. Wow, even though it was like 20, 30 minutes of what felt like this chaos, and it didn't drain my brain as much because I was understanding what was going on, and I really felt like we got to the other side. So when I tell that story, I think that was one of my like rock star parenting moments. But I mean, here I am, my kid's like trying to run through me through the door, he's about to throw his chair. But it was really pivotal. And so I tell that story because I just want everybody to appreciate it can be the slightest thing, right? I used to consult to a daycare in Langley, in the inner city, and a lot of children with living with adversity. And things like just going to wash your hands before snack time would just throw these kids into a tailspin. And I remember one of the support workers saying like, what do I do? And I was like, you tell him he's safe. You tell him you're right here. You tell him you've got this. We're gonna get this done, right? She's like, well, why would I tell him he's safe? It's just washing his hands. Because that's what his brain is registering, right? That's what those brains get really good at adapting for survival when situations are not safe, physically, emotionally, or otherwise. What happens then is we put those brains into an environment that is now safe, and their adaptation skills don't work very well for them, right? So when we ask them to wash their hands, they kind of can go into those tailspins. Does that make sense? Yeah? Can you think of a moment, an experience you've had with a child or some of the children in your care? Yeah.
I can think of a couple of weeks ago, our 6-year-old picked up a chair and a teacher and threatened to throw it. And it was, put that chair down, or you're going to the office, put it. And when you were telling that story, I thought, how unfortunate she didn't know what you just said.
Yeah.
Because it would have turned him around.
Exactly.
And now he's home, not going to school after lunch hour and making a slow
Return back. Yeah. And I always think, is it that he needs the gradual entry back, or do we need to educate that teacher? And it's unsettling. It is unsettling. I have a really good girlfriend who now lives in Portland. She's one of the most amazing teachers. And she just has this natural, intuitive way of connecting with children. But she's working in a bit of a high-risk school in Portland right now, and and we were talking, and she said she's teaching grade 1 or grade 2, maybe it's grade 2. And a little girl was in her class and ended up attacking her and punching and scratching. And she's like, Rebecca, it rocked my world, you know? So I understand from teachers' perspectives, we often go into that fear response as well, right? But if we can understand that, you know, that message could have shifted. I was watching a little video by Bruce Perry at another event on Monday, and it showed a kindergarten club. Oh no, it wasn't. It was last night. There was a viewing in Langley of the movie Resilience. Has anybody seen that? Resilience, the stress response, the something. Anyway, it's excellent if you have a chance to see that viewing. And it was a kindergarten classroom, again, high-risk neighborhood. And this teacher just had this lovely way of being very alpha with the group. And you know, she was getting the kids all to line up, and she's like, oh, we need still bodies, I need to see still bodies. And then one little guy was being anything but still, but she went in there and she's like, I'm really worried you're gonna hurt your body. And that's how she sort of shifted him into, rather than, you need to listen to what I'm saying, you need to put it down or else, right? So I think, you know, I always say to parents or caregivers, we do need to step in and set limits. We do need to create safety. But often if we're able to do that with a message of taking care of, this is what needs to happen, this is my job, putting the onus on us to take care of rather than putting the onus on the child to behave.
It's the school.
Oh, of course it is.
Sorry.
Good luck with that phone call. Okay, can we move on from that? Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah,
Question.
please.
My sons,
Yes.
one of them, we have a rapport that we build each other up and
Yes.
gets into.
Yes.
But I make a point of, after we've gone through that and we talk about each of our roles and where
Yeah.
I've gone wrong and where he's gone wrong and how that built up.
Okay.
Does that help with those connections, like afterwards? Because I'm like, this is what I need to start to change.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, to help
So
us.
what helps in those situations, and thank you for bringing that up, is we are all going to have moments where we sort of fall off the circle. Well, I do circle security, so I use that term. We fall off the circle of being the hands, right, and sort of stepping in and doing that supportive role. That's just part of parenting. That's just part of caregiving. What is really important is that we're able to step back in and do some repair around that. So by you stepping in at another point to sort of kind of debrief and reconnect and saying something like, Mommy got so frustrated that my yelly voice got away from me, or I need to work on slowing down my breathing so that I can stay calmer, so that I can step in and help you. Those are really important because that's, you know, children don't develop security because we've never messed up. Children develop security because when we do mess up, we're able to step in and repair that. So that's important. Now, in terms of expectations we might put on a child, I think that when we talk about what they can do differently, when it's done with a curiosity, when it's done with an intent of trying to draw out positive intention, then it can be helpful to start to prime that integrative functioning.
I always tell them that we first need to recognize that it's happening,
Yeah,
and then we build from there. And next time you might not recognize it's happening until we talk about it afterwards.
yeah.
But
yeah.
the more we talk
Yeah.
about it, the more you're going to be able to
Or
recognize.
next time it's happening, I may be able to step in and help you, right? Now, so you brought up, I'll get to you in just a minute, you brought up the point, and I remember these days, my boys are redheads, and everything they say about redheads is true, so they're fiery, right? And so I remember those moments where, you know, they would escalate, and then I would try and be like, don't you dare, and then they would, you know, and it would just go up and up and up. And I remember probably after a lot of my work within the Bruce Perry and understanding this, all of a sudden, have a wonderful trip, Joe. All of a sudden, it sort of clicked for me that I was like I can't go there anymore. I can't go there, right? Because I need to build that brain.
As we were going through that, I saw
Every step,
every
exactly,
step.
exactly. So now that you've seen the steps, that's going to be a game changer, right? But also thinking about what's my job in this moment. And when I say our only job is to get to calm, I can't tell you how many situations I've said that to my son, or I've said that to other children I'm working with. Our only job is to get to calm, and I say our only job. I never say your job. Because if I say your job is to get to calm, I don't know how to get to calm, right? I can't breathe. So you're sort of throwing them out in the jungle and saying, good luck surviving. And they're not meant to do that. So two things to think about for ourselves so that we can regulate enough to be able to step in and co-regulate is to think about what our job is in the moment. But I also think that for us to be able to step in and recognize that sometimes we need to ground ourselves, right? And a presentation that was happening last night, it was such a good presentation by a family doctor on the brainstem and all of the automatic responses in our brainstem, except for there's one that we can control in our brainstem, and it's our breathing, right? That's the one function we can control. And so by knowing that, and also knowing what I learned is that when we breathe in, that activates our sympathetic nervous system. That actually raises our heart rate, raises our blood pressure, gets us ready for fight or flight. But we all have to breathe in, right? Or we'd all be passed out right now. When we breathe out, that's the part of our breathing that activates the parasympathetic nervous system. And if we are able to slow that down enough, that's what optimally activates that parasympathetic nervous system. So if I were to measure or count all of us breathing right now for a minute, we'd all sort of fall within that 15 to 22 times a minute that we're breathing without even thinking about it. In order to really get into that parasympathetic nervous system, that rest and digest place in our brain, we need to be breathing only 6 times per minute. So you have to really slow it down. So I just think about really slowing down, right? And if you're doing this with kids, if you tell them to breathe, they're not going to breathe, right? But if we can get close enough, if we can kind of step in there, and we start to slow down our breathing, they sometimes can fall into that rhythm. But even just us slowing down our breathing can be enough. So that's one thing. The other thing that landed after I did this, that landed on it for me with my boys, is my rule of thumb is as they go up, I have to go down. So again, how effective are we when we're all rattled and unsettled and yelling, right? They don't listen to you. They listen when you get really quiet and your rate of speech slows down and you become very certain in your tone. So if I'm working with a child doing play therapy, I have a lot of boys I work with, and a lot of things that tend to happen is as we're transitioning out of play, their brains start to get dysregulated, right? And when they start to get dysregulated, guess what happens to all the toys in my office? They start to fly everywhere. So when I start to see that happening, I'm like, Johnny, we are not throwing the toys all over the office today. We're going to stand up, walk to the door, and walk down the hall. And all of a sudden they're like, okay, right? But if I was like, don't, why are you doing that? Don't throw those toys. You're making such a big mess, right? They're just going to be, ah. So think about if you can challenge yourself to, as they go high, you go low, tone of voice, pacing of voice, certainty in voice, right? It can make a huge difference. Yeah. Another question?
My question is more for older teens.
Okay.
And we do some calls over the phone when they're like really hyper aroused.
Yes.
Can you say things like that over the phone and have it actually make a difference? Because they won't see you slow down your breathing.
No, they won't see But that's a good question. I haven't done sort of crisis counseling over the phone, but I think that if you think about what they need on the phone at that moment, they need to feel like they can kind of land in that soft place, land in somebody's care. So if you're able to communicate, we'll get to this issue, I can hear this is really upsetting. Right now, I know what you need. What I want you to do is this. And you can even kind of do it. And if you think about it, if any of you do yoga in here, and you do that, what do they call it, the ujjayi breathing, where it sounds like the ocean in your throat, you can hear that through the phone. So sometimes I'll have kids listen to me as I'm sort of demonstrating what that sounds like. So when you get the, right, and you hear that, so if they can hear that ocean sound for a longer time, and they can start to mimic that, you know, we can say, let's just do this a few times, and then tell me more about that. Let's do this a few more times, and then tell me more about that. Then I think they would be able to, my husband gets, well, my husband and I have a girlfriend, and they're both Geminis, and they're very similar. So they're lovely, but they get very intense and very fired up, right? And so because I practice this so much with my kids, I actually do this with my husband now. Poor guy. He's like, you're using that tone with me again. I'm like, I know, because you're getting fired up, right? And then my girlfriend does the same, and the other day they were both talking, and I stepped in, and I don't know, I can't remember what it was about, and I started using that tone, and she's like, you're using that psychology thing. And I'm like, I'm just getting everything settled, you know? So people notice when you shift the way that you're saying things, and kids will notice that as well. Yeah.
How do you deal with a kid who, when you tell them our only job is to get to calm,
Yes.
says, no, I want to solve this problem and I want to solve it right now.
Yeah. I talk about where we're at in our brain. I don't know how many times I've had that over homework situations,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Is that, no, it needs to get done.
Yeah.
And I say, we can't get anything done until we get into that calm part of our brain.
Yeah.
I'm right here, we're gonna get there, right? You kind of have to just sort of repeat the same message in that low, slow, kind of calm, but certain way. I know you wanna figure it out. I know we can figure it out, but we can't figure it out until we get back into that calm part of our brain.
Sometimes that sends him up
Yeah.
the ramp.
Yeah.
When we have to wait through the
Well,
whole process.
Yes, and
until we
sometimes you
reach
do have to
utilities,
wait,
right?
yeah. And that's okay, right?
It's just exhausting.
It's exhausting, but sometimes I think we have.
Teach any sort of regulation if we always have to go through the.
It does teach regulation.
It does?
Yes,
Yeah.
because, so here was our math homework experience last year, and I was so thankful that I'm terrible at math. So as soon as my boys get into high school, well, probably by the time we got into grade 5, I couldn't really help them much anymore. So I went into psychology. I wanted to do industrial psychology, but I couldn't even do that because the math was just too much. Anyway, so last year, grade 8 math, and fortunately that my husband had to do this because he's the math guy. But this was our process every night sitting down for homework for quite a while. Is, okay, let's figure out what needs to be done. I don't know what needs to be done. Okay, well, let's read it. And my boys took French immersion, so it's all in French. Clever on our part. We don't speak French. So, okay, well, let's try and figure it out. But the whole process was, I can hear my husband talking quietly, and my son being like, ah! Right? And then talking quietly, ah! And then talking quietly, ah! And then talking quietly, and then stomping off, going to the bathroom, starting to cry, coming back, and then he could sit down and do it, right? So it was supporting that process of adaptation. So adaptation builds resilience. It's when that, again, that futility sets in, we're gonna have to do this, and it's gonna be a lot to try and figure it out, but when that sort of futility sets in and you're able to soften to those tears or kind of go to that letting go point, then you come back and that's resilience and that's growing the brain. So what you have to think about, it's not really a matter of the length of time, but it's has have they come out on the other side of the upset still feeling connected? For me, that's the whole thing, right? The upset could be 5 minutes, the upset could be 30 minutes, the upset could be 45 minutes, or an hour, depending on how stuck that brain gets in that place. But you're still supporting that wiring by supporting that. But if you're focused on trying to get them to calm right away, then you're gonna be frustrated and exhausted. So you kind of have to, you kind of have to let go of that goal. You know, I talk about if our goal is to just be with in that emotional state, we don't need to fix it, we don't need to change it, we don't need to minimize it, we just have to be with it. Then it's not as exhausting. I mean, it can take a long time, but we don't end up feeling as frustrated and exasperated at times when we see this process. Okay? All right. Ooh, we could spend all day talking about this, couldn't we?
Yeah.
Or maybe I could spend all day talking about this.
I have a little, it's not a little incident, but it's my husband and I are grandparents. We have a 10-year-old,
Okay.
which we've had since 10 months old.
Okay.
In the beginning, he was the only one that could calm down, because all he did was both on his chest,
Oh, yeah.
and then I would fall asleep.
Okay.
Didn't work for me, and didn't work for my daughter.
Ah.
You know, so anyway, we went from there, and slowly more interactive.
Yeah.
And then the daughter is out of the picture.
Yeah.
So he's in school. We brought him up with no yelling, no hitting, no rough touching, none of that ever. And he's grown up to be a really nice little guy. He got into an incident at school on the recess, and he's on the big side.
Yeah.
I love it, chubby.
Yeah.
And this older boy, grade 7 boy, and a boy from his class trapped him outside, and the older boy was holding his arms back. I can't understand where these kids are coming or why, because he is so passive. I'm not going to say passive because he's very demonstrative.
Yeah, but he's not impulsive and aggressive.
Yeah, that's right. He will try to get away before he would fight with someone.
Yeah.
So anyway, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? So he said, I'm going to go home.
Yeah.
I'm going to get my gun. I'm going to shoot you.
In this day
His
and age.
guns are Nerf guns, and his uncle gave him one of those rifles with that Christmas story.
Yeah.
That's what he said.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And he was upset.
Yeah, of course.
The other boy had a wound on him, and he was going to rub it on him. And just prior to that, his mother had an injury, and it was a serious infected injury. None of us could touch it, right? And I guess this heightened that he didn't want to be touched by it. So finally, he broke free. He went and told. There was a sub that day, so that he had to go tell the principal. Right? And these two kids were in trouble before. He's been written up. But 2 days after this incident, he approached those two boys in the school. He says, Baba, he says, I fixed them. I said,
Oh no, dear.
he says, you know, and so he talked to the boys, and he says, we shook hands and agreed to not do that ever again.
Wow. That's a mature brain.
Oh.
You've grown a mature brain.
He's on the bright side, and because he brought him up so passive.
Yeah.
But the thing is, now he's not so passive. He's doing harder schoolwork and things like that. He wants to be successful. He wants to be like his grandpa.
Yeah. So you see more of the frustration coming in.
Yeah, but he still is back.
Yeah.
You know, he'll slip back to the childish thing.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, but
I think that goes back to what we talked about, is that even when that integrative functioning starts to get wired up, when things feel too intense,
usually
we lose the mix, right?
Just,
Yeah. And so right now, wanting to do really well in schoolwork, and if it's not falling really easily, he starts to lose his mix.
Yes.
Yeah, and we just have to
So
be
he's
with that
he
and
has
support
little
that.
fits at the kitchen table because
Yeah.
it's just not quite working out. So
Yeah.
we switch off. Larry will do it for a while, and then I will do it for a while. Or if we have to stay out of the room, that's what we do.
Yeah, exactly.
Or he goes and he does something else.
Yeah,
You know, so
Yeah.
just-
it can be quite a process.
Yeah.
I'm so happy my oldest is in university now and we just don't even know what's going on there. Okay, so this, this comes from a lot of the Stuart Shanker, and it's just to kind of get a concept of stress behavior versus risk behavior. And it's funny because if I think, I was talking to a group going back a while ago, and I said, I've been doing this for 25 years now. When I started out, we were more in the sort of behavioral framework, right? But the more I understand the brain and the stress response system and the attachment system and what it's meant to do, I really struggle to even define what misbehavior would be in children. I do. And I'm sure you guys could come up with lots of examples, and we won't get into that discussion. I find that I tend to default to the stress behavior or default to positive intentions, right? Those of us who are raising teenagers, we get that sort of snarky, talking back, disrespectful kind of thing. So I got through it with my first one with the whole, I'm sure you're not meaning to be disrespectful right now, but it's sounding disrespectful. Oh, no mom, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound that way. Okay, just checking in, right? So a lot of times I'll fall on that. But what we need to understand in particular about this is that, especially with caregivers, teachers, just as you mentioned with the lifting the chair of your little 6-year-old, it's to understand this distinction, because if we treat stress behavior in the way that we would typically treat misbehavior, which tends to be with consequencing and all of that, we're going to make the situation worse. And that's not what we want to do, right? We didn't come into all of this to make the situation worse. So it's important to think about when we're in that stress state, that not only is that the child not fully aware of what she's doing, but she has limited capacity to act differently. So this is where I struggle sometimes, because we talk to kids about their choices. We often say, well, Johnny's having a hard time making good choices. And I want to say, is Johnny actually having a hard time keeping his arousal state down? Because that's what I'm thinking it is. Because we can only make choices if we're in that calm level of arousal state. That's the only place we can make choices.
That's why I couldn't figure out how he could handle that situation with these two boys.
Yeah.
And yet come and threaten, and he's, I'm going to Leo's right now, Bob.
Yeah.
Because he just had enough.
He had enough, right?
That's the nature of his friend.
Yeah, exactly. So what are some of the things that can sort of get us into that stress behavior? And so these are some things to just think about for the children, is that sometimes there's the biological things. So for some kids, especially those sensitive kids, is noises, crowds, too much visual stimulation, not enough exercise. We're just coming out of this rainy winter. We all sort of get that cabin fever. It's hard to get, even for ourselves, as much exercise as we would want. So that can impact our state of stress. Emotional. Some of us, as we talked about temperament, some of us are pretty chill with our emotions, right? It takes a lot. My 19-year-old, he's like, I don't even know where this came from. He's like the cool as a cucumber kind of kid. Like, he doesn't, the thing he gets really excited about is skiing. He loves skiing, and he just got a new truck, right? And I could show you a picture of my girlfriend, and she's like, I've never seen him smile like that before in front of his new little red truck. But he's not that expressive about things. Like, I'll be like, are you excited about this? Like, we're going to Europe. Are you looking forward to it? And he's like, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Like, that's all we get, right? Some kids are very strong in how they feel emotions. They're just big feelers, right? both on the positive and the negative side. So we have some kids that get overexcited, right? The play might start out really calm, and then all of a sudden it's crashing and banging, and this is happening. Or some kids, are sort of very strong in that anger or that fear response. And so if you're feeling things in a really intense way, that feeds into more of what we would call that stress behavior. Some kids have some cognitive issues and that they have difficulty processing different types of information, right? It's just not landing on their brains the same way that it might be landing on our brains. And so when we see stress out of that, we kind of have to think about how are they perceiving this experience? How are they processing this experience? And so being aware of some of those differences. Some of us have challenges in the area of social. A lot of the kids you care for may have those challenges because their little systems have been on this constant alert mode. And if we're alert, we're not really tuning in to what's going on for you or you, right? So much is going on in that stress part of the brain, I'm not picking up on the other behaviors of or the other cues of other kids. And so that can create some stress. Not understanding. Pro-social, that's a big one, and I don't think we think about that as much. Pro-social means when we have difficulty coping with other people's stress. So I had a client one time, and she had a whole bunch of anxiety about other kids getting in trouble. And so she was in a classroom. I think the teacher was quite strict and all of that. And it brought her so much angst because we would again try and rationalize, well, what are the things that get us in trouble? And are those things that you do? So what are the chances that you're going to get it? And it didn't even have to do about that. It made her really overwhelmed and really uncomfortable and really sad when other kids got in trouble. She matured. We just kind of kept growing that brain. And she still struggles with anxiety because she's a sensitive person, but she doesn't struggle with that anymore, actually.
What about the cognitive and like real cognitive difficulty understanding?
Yeah. Yeah. I think for some of the situations, if we're able to understand what those cognitive difficulties are, so if we're able to access some kind of assessment to understand that, and then be able to make sense of the world in a different way for a child. So it might be making visual connections or understanding when we say it this way, they're only processing this much of it. So those can be more complex in that. The social often, needs to be supported in those social moments. And so that's a challenge because a lot of the social issues happen out on the playground where it's unstructured and there's not a lot of supervision anymore. And so we miss all these moments of being able to support. Is anybody aware of the social thinking curriculum? Michelle Garcia Winner. So she developed that to work with kids with autism, but really we use it with a lot of kids and a lot of teachers and a lot of parents and caregivers to sort of develop some language about expected and unexpected things that we do in social situations. I like that language because it neutralizes. It doesn't say this is unacceptable. It just says this is unexpected, right? And sort of really trying to be more, I think sometimes for the social, we have to be much more explicit about helping kids see and teaching kids about what's going on in those situations. Not easy things to deal with. Okay, so, oh my gosh, we've been a long time talking about headspace, haven't we? I just like this thing is I think about what headspace are they in, and that sort of talks about what headspace we need to be in terms of that emotional regulation, right? Knowing that when an individual is in high arousal, even if you have a functioning cortex, it shuts down. You cannot learn and problem solve at the same time. So all of our wonderful intentions of helping children learn an important lesson, problem solve a situation, that cannot happen when we're in a high state of arousal. So we have to work at bringing that down before When a child's in a high state of arousal, words are not processed and reasoning is useless. And it's a stuck place we get. It's probably why they go here and we go here and they go here and we go here, because we're stuck trying to reason all of this out. All kids hear is tone of voice, and so that's what we talked about. When they go high, you go low. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about connection. And I don't think we need to talk about this too much, because you guys are probably one of the most well-versed populations in the role of connection, right, for children. But really understanding that we are wired as a social species, and emotional connection is what allows us to thrive, right? There is no growth if there's not rest in that connection, and if there's not a feeling of that connection. So it's not a want. It's not that children want a connection. They need it. They need it to survive. And our brain is wired for that purpose. So we often talk about connection leading to regulation, connection to calm, disconnection leading to dysregulation. So understanding how that's hardwired, I have the Tronic still face in here, but because I didn't think I was doing this workshop, I didn't bring volume. But I might show it to you guys. Has anybody seen the still face? Yeah, okay, so we don't need to watch it again. It's hard to watch, isn't it? What happens, I'll describe. Has anybody not seen it? Okay, so basically the experiment is intended to show that not only our physical presence is important for children, but our emotional presence is important. So what we see in the video is kind of like an 8-month-old baby and mom come into the lab, and they're directed to interact as they typically would. And then mom is instructed to turn her face and turn back and be completely non-responsive. And it's hard to watch, right? Because how many of us have been able to not respond to a baby if a baby's been in front of us? Like, it's almost impossible because we're wired to do that. And so what's demonstrated is that when that connection is lost, that you see all the signs of that baby becoming dysregulated, and when mom sort of comes back, then baby gets settled and calm. But what I think is so powerful in the demonstration of that video is it really shows the structure and hierarchy of attachment, right? So attachment being wired in our brains in such a way that in relationship, attachment is meant to do this. So that somebody's meant to be in the position of caring for, and somebody's meant to be in the position of depending on that care. Now for adults and children, who's meant to be in the position of caring for? The adults, right? So if we think about our adult relationships, whether it's with partners, significant others, friends, often that attachment goes back and forth, right? So I might have a really difficult day, and you see that look on my face, and you say, sit down, I'm going to make you a cup of tea. And I'm like, oh, somebody knows what I need. That feels so good, right? And I might do the same for you. It's not meant to go back and forth with children. It's meant to be that we're in the position of caring for, and they're in the position of depending on that care. Now, when you have children that come into your care that have not had that experience, guess what happens when you step in and try and care for them? They resist, right? So it takes a lot to build in that experience for them. But what is demonstrated in the video, and then, so anyway, it's meant to be that way. And what happens in that, because in all relationships somebody's meant to be in charge and somebody's meant to depend, if a child experiences us as not being able to do the job of taking care of, so they're too much for us, we're too overwhelmed by them, we can't handle them, we don't know what to do, they automatically go into this role of being in charge. And when they're in charge, they drive us absolutely insane, right? Because it's not meant to be that way. But their brains are wired to pursue us because their survival depends on it. And so what you see in the still phase I mean, we see this at birth, but in the still phase at even the age of 8 months, that as soon as mom's not there, baby's pursuing, right? So baby's looking and pointing and cooing and reaching and screeching, because that's what's mechanistically wired in that brain. So if we were to see that, if we were to think about what are the actions that infants do to pursue us, well, what does that look like in a 3-year-old? What does that look like in a 6-year-old? What does that look like in a 12-year-old, right? It often looks like really negative, attention-seeking, unacceptable behavior, when a lot of it is pursuit. And so if we can see it for pursuit and we can step in and provide more than they're pursuing, we help bring that attachment system, that arousal system to rest, so that all that thriving and that maturing brain can start to develop. So it's really important in that sense.
So, how do you, with FASD, where they're very concrete and that makes sense, with this person
Yes.
in this situation,
Yeah.
but then you move
Yeah.
half an hour later
Yeah.
and they're in another situation,
Yeah.
another person
Yeah.
could be the same, like because there's real,
There's
issues there. Like,
yeah.
So how do you?
The challenge with something like FASD, and I don't think we know enough about it yet, and I think we still need to be hopeful about it based on what we know about neuroplasticity. I think if we can repair and change the brains of stroke victims, why can't we repair and change the brains of children with FASD? But I don't know that we know.
Applying the stroke victim to the FASD?
What's that?
Why don't we apply the stroke?
It's a good question. I don't know. I'm not sure who or what's happening in the area of research with that, but I feel like that needs to be coming with all of this, right? Because if we look at in our prison systems, like I think it's like 60, well at least in the US, 60 or 70% of incarcerated males have fetal alcohol syndrome, right? I mean, the horrible, and I don't know the history, the horrible thing that just happened in Florida. As soon as I looked at that kid, I said to my husband, he has FASD. Like he has all of the features, right? And he was adopted and all of this. It's tragic, very tragic. So I think the challenge with what we know and have right now with FASD is there's this sort of, I don't know, we call it sort of like this Swiss cheese brain, right? There's these chunks that are missing, and there doesn't seem to be this transferability from one situation to another situation. So every situation is a brand new situation. Every day can be a new day. And so I think it's really challenging to be able to try and stay attuned into what's going on for that. And it's challenging to then educate everybody that's stepping into a support role around that, right? So ideally, for a child with FASD, every person would have an understanding of what's going on. Every person would have an understanding of what the processing issues are, the social issues are, to be able to step in and do that.
I think instead of thinking what happened to you, or what's wrong with that kid?
Yeah.
We need to start thinking what happened.
Yeah, and what do they need,
Yeah, what
right?
do they need?
And I think that sometimes, one of the biggest shifts in actually building emotional regulation in children is to shift from thinking about the behavior to thinking about the need. And so when a lot of times, most of the times when families come into our practice and when I talk with families, I tell them I'm not talking about behavior. Like we're not talking about behavior. We're only talking about need. So what's going on for that child? What do they need? What's happening? What do they need, right? And so it can make a big difference, but it's challenging because those needs pop up in different situations and unpredictability. It could be a learning disability, it could be all of that, right? Yeah. So it is a challenge. One of the just sort of things from Circle of Security program that I do, one of their handouts, I think, or this is a map, and we won't go through all of this, we don't have enough time. I wanted to talk just a little bit about the process of emotional regulation. Sorry, I'll go back. So Understanding that, again, just as we're born with a left and a right hemisphere, we are born with the capacity to feel all of the emotions that we feel, right? So that's in us from the very beginning. What we're not born with is the capacity to organize all of those feelings. And so what we often aren't aware of is just how long, or maybe surprised by, is just how long children need us to help them organize those feelings, right? And so if we look at the process here, we see early on, feelings are organized by the caregiver, okay? So if you have an infant who's fussing, we just step in and we do what we think is needed, right? So they're fussing because they're hungry, we step in and feed them, now they're all settled. They're wet, they're dirty, we step in and change them, now they're all settled. They're needing connection, we step in and we make those connections, and they're feeling all settled. Sometimes we don't know what they need. They might have colic, they might have these really out of whack sensory systems, and it doesn't seem like anything we do is helping them settle, except that our presence in itself is serving as a buffering effect, right? So if you're carrying a colicky infant around for hours and their colic lasts that amount of time, that colic may not settle right away, but the fact that you're there is a buffer to the stress of that, right? So that's not a toxic stress because we're there as a buffer. So just our efforts and our intentions to step in and help organize serves as a buffer. As children get a little bit older, we start to help them with that, right? So we're not stepping in and actually organizing their feelings, but we're starting to organize it with our help. So maybe we can start to read the cues of their arousal going up, and we think about, well, what is it that's calming for them, right? My little guy, because I worked with a lot of within occupational therapy in infant mental health, so we got versed in a lot of sensory areas. And so when my Liam was 3 and 4, and he would get unsettled quite a bit, I would always have some gum on hand and the music, right? And the shoulder presses. Has anybody done the deep pressure shoulder presses? Oh, get somebody to do that to you today. So if somebody stands behind you and holds their hands flat, and you just sort of press like firmly down, kind of 3 to 5 times, it's sort of that deep pressure that sends those signals to your central nervous system to calm, right? Pressing our hands together. Somebody mentioned the other day, doing like a push-up on a chair. So if you're sitting on a chair, you can push up with your arms to do. So if we know some of those things, and we see children have those cues, so they're starting to get really prickly, their voice is starting to raise up, they're starting to run around the room in circles, we might step in and just sort of guide them to what they need to calm. So if we're in a preschool or a daycare setting, we might just step in and say, let's see what's in the water table today, right? And not even talk about their behavior, because early on, if we talk about their behavior, then often we get resistance because they just automatically think we're trying to deal with the behavior, right? So this has a couple of stages in this area. I think first of all, we just step in and do what they need to do. I worked with a mom years and years and years ago when I was doing outreach, actually here in Surrey. And she had, I think she had about 6 children in her care, mom, but had been involved with the ministry for quite a while. And her one little daughter was 4, I think, that was sort of our target client. And so what would happen is this little girl would become overstimulated, which would be easy to happen in a house of 6 children. And she would start running around the room and hitting everybody on the head. She would just run and hit and hit and hit and hit. And mom was really working hard to try and curb this behavior, right? So she was trying to put her in the corner and do all kinds of timeouts and blah, 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 blah. So I said, why don't we look at this as a little bit differently? I said, tell me about the times when she's most calm. What is she doing? And she's like, well, usually if she sits down with her coloring book, she's really calm. I said, okay, let's try something different, because I can see you're working really hard to try and shift this behavior, and it's not working, right? Because we all know timeouts just don't work, and often they make it worse. So I said, how about we recognize the running around and hitting everybody on the head as a cue to her becoming overexcited, overstimulated, high arousal, and we step in and we guide her over to her coloring materials when you see that cue, right? You don't need to say anything about her hitting everybody on the head. You just have to kind of step in and say, I know what you need right now, come with mom, we're gonna do this for a while. And so mom was able to do that and make that shift, and it made a big difference. And so when we think about then what was the pathway that was wired in that brain, it was like overstimulated, calm, right? And so over time, if our brain has that experience, we can start to do that on our own. Over time, after like 50 million thousand times that we do that, right? We can hopefully start to do that on our own, because we're not always going to be able to be with our children. There's going to be situations when they're, when my son was playing baseball, I used to love to watch this, because he would get out on the mound, you see all the kids do this, and they're like, and they're self-regulating, right? Because that's nerve-wracking when you've got a pitch flying at your head, and they're self-regulating. And so all along the way, this happens because we've had somebody be there with us doing that. We've had somebody co-regulate us. We've had somebody organize our feelings, reflect back to us what's going on. And so then as that develops, the reality that we need to realize is that we can go back and forth, right? So even if that's developed, it's not always going to happen. If you have your grandson who's really frustrated over his homework, he may need you to step in beside him and just be right there. That may not be a time where you say, you need to get yourself sorted out so that you can get that math done, right? And so what does that look like? For me, when I could do the 5th grade math, we would step in and he would say, okay, and I would whisper. I'd be like, I'm right here. What's 5 times 4? It's 20. And we would just kind of do this whole sort of calm down thing. Now, I think that, what does it mean to you when I say to organize a child's feelings? What does that mean to people?
Wondering around, with them about.
Wondering with them what it is? Okay. So trying to reflect back what's going on for them, right? So think about just basically, think about mirroring. Think about putting yourself in their shoes and communicating somehow that you get what's going on for them. Even if you don't agree with it, even if you are like, I don't understand why this cookie can create such a big kerfluffle, but for them, that's what's happening. So having the child feel felt is really what this is all about. And what happens for us is that when we have that experience of being in a connection and really feeling like somebody gets what's going on, you actually get a dose of oxytocin in the brain. So you're actually changing the brain chemistry. And oxytocin is our happy, love, feel-good hormone, right? And so that can be really impactful, and it's really hard to do. It can be really hard to do, right? But what does it look like? So it can look something like this. I was doing play therapy with a 7-year-old a few years ago. He does not yet have a regulated system. Lots of adversity, I would say, in his background. And mom often very overwhelmed by his emotional expression. So we were working on this whole concept of mirroring and not being afraid of the emotions and all of that. And so we were having our play therapy session, and he was telling me all about how he was going to go on a play date with Johnny. Every random child I name is Johnny. Johnny afterwards, and he was really excited about it, right? So we're all finished up, we go out into the waiting room, and he asks Mom, are we going right to Johnny's? Are we going right to Johnny's? And Mom said, oh, I just talked to Johnny's mom, and he's not able to play today. It's not gonna work out. You're such a stupid mommy! You're so stupid! Right? How do we organize that? What does that look like to organize that?
I can see you're upset. I
Okay. So if I'm really upset,
know. You know,
and you do the whole counselor, I can see you're upset, what's likely gonna happen? You don't know what I'm feeling, right? You don't get it. So how is it that we can, without throwing a big fit, show that we really get it? You were so looking forward to the play date and it didn't work out. It's so hard when things don't work out. I know you're disappointed, right? I would be disappointed too. I don't like it when things don't work out. I have a hard time with that. Of course you're gonna have a hard time with that. We'll get through it, and you get out of that waiting room as fast as you can before you get call more names, right? But it's really trying to kind of match and join them in that experience for just a moment. You're not gonna stay stuck in there, right? You're not gonna stay stuck in there. Sometimes we join in there, we might reflect back a couple of times. If child is having a hard time settling, now we have to contain and kind of move on, right? I know you're disappointed, it's not gonna work out, but this is what we're gonna do now, right? But just having that experience of being able to reflect back is really, really powerful. Think about a time when somebody tried to talk you out of your feelings.
Yeah.
How does that feel?